She handed him a Rolex. Then she turned around and handed me a pair of socks with the price tag still on them, $9.47. In front of every person I had spent 26 years helping her impress. That was the moment I understood that our marriage had already ended. I just hadn't been informed. My name is Gerald, and I'm 58 years old. I'm telling you this story from the front porch of a cottage I inherited from my grandmother and never told my wife about. The wind off the water smells like salt and pine, and the coffee in my hands is hot, and I am, for the first time in longer than I can measure, genuinely at peace. But to understand how I got here, you have to come back with me to Atlanta, to the night of December 14th, to the Harrington Grand Hotel ballroom in Buckhead, where my wife Claudette held her company's annual gala, and where, in the span of about 45 seconds, she dismantled 26 years of marriage in public. I want to be honest with you before I start. I almost didn't tell this story, not because I'm ashamed I passed shame 6 months ago and kept going, but because some parts of it still make me feel something I can't quite name. Not anger. Grief, maybe. The kind of grief that doesn't have a ceremony. So let me take you back. The Harrington Grand is the kind of venue that makes you feel underdressed, no matter what you're wearing. Claudette and I had attended half a dozen corporate events there over the years, and every time I'd stood at her elbow in my best suit, smiling at colleagues whose names I'd memorized because she asked me to, making conversation about industries I didn't work in, playing the role she needed me to play, the supportive husband, the gracious host, the man who exists to make his successful wife look complete. That night, she barely glanced at me when I came downstairs. "You look fine," she said, already scrolling her phone. "Just don't monopolize anyone's time, and please don't bring up the kitchen renovation. It makes us sound domestic." Don't sound domestic. At a Christmas party, with my own wife. I fixed my own tie in the hallway mirror and told myself it was just stress. She'd been buried in a difficult fourth quarter. The company had hit record numbers this year, and the pressure of that success had made her distant, distracted, short with me in ways I kept finding excuses for. I was good at finding excuses. I'd led decades of practice. The ballroom was everything you'd expect: long tables draped in white linen, a live jazz quartet, candles that probably cost more per hour than my first apartment's rent. Claudette swept into the room like she owned it, which, in most practical ways, she did. Her company had grown from 11 employees to nearly 300 during our marriage. I had watched her build it from our kitchen table. I had given up a consulting partnership in Nashville so she could take a meeting in Atlanta that changed everything. I had hosted dinner parties for her investors, driven her to the airport at 4 a.m, managed our home so completely that she once admitted she didn't know where we kept the spare light bulbs. I was the infrastructure of her life. And infrastructure, you eventually learn, is only noticed when it fails. I found myself at the bar somewhere around 8 o'clock, nursing a bourbon and watching Claudette work the room with the kind of ease that looks effortless because it cost her everything to develop. A woman named Patricia from her operations team came and stood beside me, and she looked at me with that particular expression I'd grown used to: warm, slightly apologetic, as if she were sorry for something she hadn't done. "You must be so proud of her," Patricia said. "Every day," I said. And I meant it. Even then. Even that night. The gift exchange began closer to 9. Claudette had organized it. Of course, she organized everything. There was a tree in the corner, decorated in the company's navy and gold colors, and assistants had arranged wrapped packages beneath it throughout the evening. I had contributed some gift cards on Claudette's behalf. Generic, inoffensive, appropriate. What I did not know about was the navy blue box. I didn't see her take it from wherever she'd kept it hidden. One moment she was laughing near the bar, and the next she was holding a slim rectangular case in both hands and calling across the room in a voice I hadn't heard her use in years, warm, personal, almost tender. "Jalen," she said. "Come here." Jalen Burgess was 29 years old. He'd been Claudette's executive assistant for nearly 2.5 years. He was polished, quick, ambitious in a way that he managed to make look like enthusiasm rather than hunger. Claudette had talked about him often, how efficient he was, how indispensable, how he anticipated her needs before she articulated them. I had met him exactly 3 times and found him pleasant enough. I had no particular feelings about him. Until that moment, she handed him the box with both hands, like an offering. The room was already beginning to quiet. People can feel ceremony even when it isn't announced. Something about the stillness of her posture, the deliberateness of her movement, made the conversations around me taper off. Jalen opened the box. Inside was a watch. I knew what it was before I could see the face, the weight of the velvet interior, the particular gleam of brushed steel, the specific way everyone in the room drew breath simultaneously. It was a Patek Philippe Aquanaut. I knew this because I had mentioned wanting one for my 55th birthday, and Claudette had told me it was an irresponsible purchase for someone at our stage of financial planning. She had bought it for her assistant. "You have been the backbone of everything we built this year," Claudette said, her voice carrying across the room with genuine warmth. "I wanted you to know that your contribution doesn't go unnoticed." The applause started slowly, then spread. Someone in the back of the room whistled. I stood very still. Jalen lifted the watch from its velvet bed, and his face did the thing faces do when they receive something they already knew was coming, but still managed to perform surprise for a flash of satisfaction, quickly softened into gratitude, perfectly calibrated. He looked at Claudette the way I used to look at her 20 years ago. Before looking at her became something I did carefully. And then she turned to me. "Gerald." Her voice changed registers. It became the voice she used for quarterly reviews. Efficient. Conclusive. "Your turn." She reached under the tree and pulled out a package wrapped in the drugstore plastic it had come in. No ribbon, no card. She walked it over to me the way you hand something to a valet, functional, transactional, already thinking about the next thing. I opened it. Black dress socks. 2 pairs. The price sticker was still on the plastic, $9.47. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I looked up. Patricia from operations had gone completely pale. Someone near the windows had stopped mid-sentence and not resumed. Jalen was studying his new watch with sudden intense focus, as if he'd found something fascinating in the bezel that required his full attention. Claudette leaned close to my ear. She smelled like the perfume I'd given her for our anniversary. "Stay humble, Gerald," she whispered. "People receive exactly what they've earned." I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something. If you have ever stood in a room full of people while someone reduced you to nothing, if you have ever felt the specific violence of being publicly dismissed by a person who was supposed to be your partner, your equal, your person, then you already understand what happened inside me in that moment. You know the way your throat locks. You know the way your hands do something automatic, folding the package, steadying themselves, while your mind is doing something entirely different, something quiet and cold and final. I said, "Thank you," very thoughtful. My voice was completely steady. Claudette smiled and turned back toward the room. The party continued. Music resumed. Conversations cautiously restarted. I stood holding $9.47 worth of socks while my wife laughed at something Jalen said near the windows, her hand resting briefly on his forearm, and I began calmly, quietly, with absolute clarity to understand what I was actually looking at. The drive home was silent. I made one attempt at conversation, and Claudette answered in half sentences about revenue projections. We pulled into our driveway in Druid Hills at 11:30, and she went directly to her home office, citing emails. I sat in the living room beneath the Christmas tree, our tree, decorated with ornaments we'd collected over 26 years of travel, of anniversaries, of 2 people building a life together, and I held a package of drugstore socks and I let myself feel it. All of it. Every dismissed dinner, every moved city, every evening I sat across from her while she worked through the meal we'd planned to share. I let myself feel it, and then I set it down. And I did something I had never done before. I made a decision entirely for myself. I didn't sleep. I lay beside Claudette and listened to her breathe, and thought about 26 years of choosing her. At some point past midnight, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Then again, she'd left it face up, which was unusual. Claudette always left it face down when she slept. Something I had noticed without understanding until now. I reached over and looked at the screen. The messages were from Jalen. The first, "Tonight was everything. You were brilliant." The second, sent 12 minutes later, "I keep thinking about the way you looked at me when you handed me the watch. Like I was the only person in the room." The third, "I cannot wait until you finally do it. Leave him. We've been patient long enough. Leave him." I set the phone down. My hands were completely still. I think that's the detail I remember most, how still my hands were. As if my body had been expecting this and was finally, quietly, relieved to have confirmation. I got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee at 1:15 in the morning, and I sat in the dark, and I thought about a conversation I had had 3 years ago with a financial advisor named Morris, who had asked me, very gently, whether I had any independent holdings, anything outside our joint accounts. I hadn't, at the time. I'd gone home that evening and started reading. Here is what Claudette did not know about me, what she had stopped being curious enough to know. In the years since that conversation, I had taken every dollar from my independent consulting work, the work she referred to as my little projects, with a particular tone that communicated she found it quaint, and I had invested it. Carefully. Methodically. Real estate investment trusts. Index funds. A small rental property in East Point that I had purchased, renovated, and quietly managed for 2 years. The separate account held $212,000. Claudette had no idea it existed because she had stopped paying attention to what I did with my time. She knew I was productive. She just didn't believe the productivity amounted to anything that mattered. She was wrong. At 4:30 in the morning, I went to my study, the room she called my hobby cave with the same affectionate condescension you'd use for a child's art corner, and I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside, behind old tax files and a folder of family photographs, was a manila envelope I had assembled over the past year and a half. Not because I suspected anything specific, because I was organized. Because I had always been the person in our household who kept records. Bank withdrawals I couldn't account for. Credit card charges at restaurants I'd never seen a receipt for. A pattern of hotel bookings in Midtown Atlanta on days Claudette claimed to be in client meetings across town. Jewelry purchases that never appeared in her jewelry box. I photographed every document. Then I opened our stationery drawer, took out a single sheet of paper, and wrote a letter. I won't repeat every word here, but I told her I was leaving before she woke up. I told her I knew about Jalen. I told her about the lawyer I'd quietly consulted, 3 of them, actually, across 18 months. I told her about the account she didn't know existed. And I told her that I wasn't filing for divorce immediately, because that would be too clean and too quick, and she had spent months planning how to quietly remove me from her life, so I was going to let her feel, just for a while, what not knowing feels like. I sealed the envelope and placed it under our Christmas tree. By 5:15, my car was loaded. I took my father's watch, a modest Seiko he'd worn every day for 30 years, and I left behind every gift Claudette had ever given me, including the socks. Let her find those too. I was past the city limits before sunrise. I didn't turn my phone on for 4 hours. When I did, there were 53 missed calls and 71 text messages. I sat in a roadside diner outside of Macon, ordered eggs and black coffee, and listened to her voicemails in order. The first was confusion. The second was irritation. She had a board meeting, and this was not the time. The third was something I had never heard from Claudette before. Her voice was small, uncertain. She said, "Please." I deleted them all and kept driving toward the Georgia coast, toward a cottage my grandmother had left me 5 years ago that I had been quietly restoring ever since. Claudette had visited once, pronounced it quaint, and suggested I sell it. I smiled and nodded. Then I replaced the water heater, re-insulated the walls, built a new back deck, and kept paying the property taxes. It had been my escape plan before I knew I needed one. Honestly, if I'm being real with you, and I promised myself I would be, telling this story, I wasn't certain I was doing the right thing. I believed I was. But there's a difference between knowing your reasons and knowing you're right. I kept thinking, somewhere past Savannah, whether I was being cold, whether the man I wanted to be was capable of this level of calculated silence. And then I remembered the price tag on the socks, and I kept driving. I was on the cottage porch the following morning when a number I didn't recognize called me. I almost didn't answer. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Renata Burgess, Jalen's wife. She had received the photograph I'd mailed from a gas station the previous day, Jalen and Claudette entering a Midtown hotel, taken by a private investigator I'd retained for 2 months on the suspicion I hadn't wanted to name. I had addressed it to her, at a return address I'd found through public records. I had not included a note. I trusted the photograph to speak. Renata wanted to meet. I drove back toward Atlanta the next morning and met her at a coffee shop off Peachtree Street. I expected someone devastated. I found someone organized. She was 43, a hospital administrator with the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity but from processing power running very fast beneath a quiet surface. She had a folder at her elbow, a laptop bag. She had been awake, I gathered, for most of the previous 36 hours. "How long have you known?" she asked. No preamble. I confirmed it 2 days ago. Suspected it for months. She nodded. Marcus Jalen has been different for almost a year. New habits, new confidence, the kind that doesn't come from success. It comes from being wanted. She opened the folder. "I hired an investigator 3 weeks ago. What I have matches what you sent. We spent 2 hours comparing documentation like forensic partners. The picture that emerged was more complex than 2 people being selfish. Claudette hadn't just been conducting an affair. She had been actively engineering Jalen's career trajectory inside her own company, 2 promotions he wasn't professionally qualified for, sole source contracts routed through his team, his name attached to projects where other people did the work. She was building him, shaping him, creating a version of a partner she could design from scratch rather than negotiate with as an equal. He was not a man she loved. He was a renovation project. Renata filed for divorce that same afternoon. Papers were served 2 days later at Claudette's office, during the weekly all-hands meeting, in front of 31 colleagues, including Claudette. Simultaneously, an HR complaint was filed citing Jalen's use of a corporate credit card for personal expenses. Hotel rooms, dinners, a bracelet I recognized from one of Claudette's missing receipts. The total came to $18,000 over 9 months. $1 more than the watch she'd given him at the gala. The symmetry was not lost on me. I was back at the cottage when my phone rang, and it was Claudette, and the voice on the other end was unrecognizable to me as my wife's frantic, cycling between anger and fear, telling me that Jalen was threatening to expose their relationship to the board if she didn't protect his job, and she needed me to come home and help her manage it. I sat on the porch steps and listened to her tell me that this was our problem, that if she lost her position, we lost everything we'd built together. That word. After everything. You handed me $9 socks in front of our entire professional community, I said, when she finally paused. You whispered to me that I'd gotten exactly what I deserved. So I need you to explain to me, Claudette, what exactly are we building together? Silence. Come home, she finally said. We can fix this. I'm not interested in fixing this, I said. I'm interested in being free of it. There's a difference. I hung up. I went inside. I made dinner from what I'd bought at the market that morning. I sat by the window and watched the light change over the water, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel responsible for another person's crisis. It was the most peace I had ever felt. Jalen was terminated 2 weeks later. The HR investigation substantiated the credit card fraud. He was eventually charged criminally and, after a brief trial, sentenced to 14 months. Claudette was asked to resign by her board, who determined that her professional judgment had been fatally compromised by her personal relationship with a direct report. She accepted a severance package and signed a non-disclosure agreement and walked away from everything she had spent 2 decades building. I learned this from my lawyer, who reached out periodically with updates I hadn't asked for but didn't refuse. 6 months after the Christmas gala, a silver Mercedes I recognized pulled into my gravel driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in June. I was sanding the new porch railing. I watched Claudette step out in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back without styling. She looked like someone who had stopped performing and hadn't yet figured out what was underneath. She stood at the bottom of my steps. "May I?" she said, gesturing at the porch. I stepped aside. We sat for a while without talking. She looked at the garden I'd started along the front path, lavender and salvia and a climbing rose I'd put in against the south wall. "You made it beautiful," she said. I had time. She told me what had happened. All of it. The corporate investigation. The board's decision. Jalen's arrest. The house in Druid Hills, which had gone into foreclosure when she could no longer cover the mortgage alone. She told me that Jalen had tried to implicate her in the credit card fraud and that she had responded by presenting herself to HR as a secondary victim of his manipulation. Was that true? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. "No," she said. "I knew about every charge. I suggested some of them, but when he became a liability, I protected myself." She said it without dressing it up, without the practiced neutrality she used in board presentations. Just the fact, placed on the table between us. I thought about what to say, and what I settled on was, "I'm sorry it came to this." She looked at me. "Are you really?" "I'm sorry we couldn't fix whatever broke before it cost everything." I meant it. The satisfaction I might have felt 6 months ago had burned off. What was left was something sadder and more honest. "I'm sorry that you spent so long optimizing your life, that you optimized me out of it." Claudette looked at the ocean for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was the quietest I had ever heard it. "I stopped seeing you as a person," she said. "Somewhere along the way, you became part of the background of my life. Reliable, constant, always there. And Jalen," she stopped. Started again. "He needed me. He looked at me like I was the most important thing in the room. I mistook that for love. It was just ambition looking for a ladder." We sat until the sun started dropping below the tree line. Before she left, she told me she wouldn't contest the divorce, that she wanted nothing from the settlement, only for it to be finished cleanly. "I don't want anything from you either," I said. "I just want what's mine." She nodded, walked to her car, stopped with her hand on the door. "Were you happy?" she asked. "Before all of this. Were there years when you were genuinely happy?" I thought about it honestly. "There were years when I believed the story I was living," I said. "That's not exactly the same thing, but it's what I had." She got in her car and drove away, and I sat on my grandmother's porch until the stars came out, and I thought about the man I had been and the man I was becoming. and I found that I was grateful for both of them. The one who stayed too long taught me what I was willing to survive. The one who finally left taught me what I was actually worth. Here's what this story taught me, and I want you to sit with this before you keep scrolling. The most dangerous form of disrespect is the kind that happens so slowly you learn to call it normal. Nobody hands you $9 socks on day one of a relationship. It happens in increments, a dismissal here, a condescension there, a slow renegotiation of your value until you're standing in a ballroom accepting an insult in public and thanking someone for it. The question I had to ask myself, and the question I'll leave with you, is this: what have you normalized that you should have named? If you've ever been in a room where you gave everything and were treated like you'd given nothing, leave a comment below. Tell me, number 1, if you think I handled this situation with grace. Number 2, if you think I went too far. Or number 3, if you would have walked out of that ballroom the same night. I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. Also, drop the city and the time where you're watching from. I've had people reach me from places I never expected, and there's something about knowing this story traveled that far that reminds me none of us are as alone in our experiences as we think we are. If something in Gerald's story rang true for you, if you recognized any piece of it from your own life, I hope you'll stay with this channel. Every story here is told with that same honesty. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you want to tell me your own story in the comments, I'll be reading. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.